The judge froze in court when he saw me. No one knew who I really was until I bet you're wondering what could possibly make a stone-faced, gavel-wielding judge, sitting high above a courtroom, suddenly go rigid and pale, his eyes fixed on someone in the gallery as if he'd seen a ghost. Well, that someone was me. And that moment was the culmination of a decade-long plan, a meticulous unraveling of a carefully constructed lie, and the explosive revelation of a secret that changed everything for a lot of people, most of all for him. Was I wrong for orchestrating such a dramatic reveal, for waiting for that exact moment to drop the bomb? Honestly, I don't think so, not after what I went through, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back, way back, to where this whole twisted saga began. My story starts not in a courtroom, but in a small, unassuming town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were as hard to keep as a feather in a hurricane. I grew up there, a quiet kid with big dreams and an even bigger secret heart. My parents were wonderful people, salt of the earth, as they say. My dad was a carpenter, strong and gentle, always smelling of sawdust and pine. My mom, a school teacher, with eyes that could see right through you, yet always filled with love. We weren't rich, but we were happy, and our home was always filled with laughter and the comforting aroma of my mom's famous apple pie. That all changed, of course, the day Sarah came into our lives. Sarah was my older sister by about 3 years. She was the star, the golden child, beautiful and intelligent, with a charisma that drew everyone to her like moths to a flame. I, on the other hand, was content to be in her shadow, observing, learning, and admiring. She was my hero, my confidante, and my best friend. We shared everything, from secrets whispered under starry nights to dreams sketched out on crumpled napkins. Her ambition, though, was different from mine. She wanted to escape the small town, to make a name for herself, to become someone important. And she did. She left for law school, brilliant and determined, promising to visit often, promising that nothing would change between us. For a while, she kept those promises. She'd call, she'd write, she'd even make the long drive home for holidays. We'd sit for hours, me hanging on every word as she described the bustling city, the challenging cases, the intricate world of law. She was living her dream, and I was genuinely proud of her. My pride, however, slowly began to curdle into a vague uneasiness. The calls became less frequent, the visits shorter, and her words, once so warm and familiar, started to take on a detached, almost clinical tone. She was changing, and not for the better. The final straw, for me, was when she started dating Richard Davies. Richard was, even then, a rising star in the legal world. He was handsome, charismatic, undeniably intelligent, and absolutely ruthless. He came from old money, a family with deep roots in the legal system, and he had an air of entitlement that grated on me from the moment I met him. Sarah, however, was completely smitten. She saw him as her ticket to the top, a partner who could open doors and accelerate her career. I saw a man who saw people as pawns, relationships as transactions, and loyalty as a weakness. I tried to warn her, gently at first, then more forcefully. I told her he wasn't good for her, that he was using her, but she wouldn't hear it. She accused me of being jealous, of wanting to keep her trapped in our small-town life. The arguments became more frequent, more bitter. Our once unbreakable bond began to fray, thin and transparent, until one day it simply snapped. She told me she didn't want my negativity in her life, that I was holding her back. And just like that, my hero, my best friend, was gone. Years passed. Sarah and Richard got married in a lavish ceremony I wasn't invited to. She soared through the legal ranks, her name appearing in newspapers, her face on local news segments. Richard, too, became incredibly successful, eventually becoming a respected and often feared judge. I, on the other hand, stayed in our small town, working odd jobs, saving money, and slowly, meticulously, building my own life. But the pain of Sarah's betrayal, the sting of her dismissal, never truly faded. It festered, transforming from hurt into a quiet, burning resolve. I started educating myself, not in law, but in the subtle arts of investigation, of information gathering, of understanding how systems truly worked. I spent hours in libraries, poring over legal texts, reading biographies of famous investigators, even learning the basics of forensic accounting and digital forensics. It was a strange, almost obsessive pursuit, fueled by a need to understand what had truly happened to my sister, and what kind of man Richard truly was. I never stopped loving Sarah, despite everything. That's the painful truth. I loved the sister she used to be, the one who shared secrets and dreams. And I believed, deep down, that the real Sarah was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of ambition and Richard's influence. My investigation started innocently enough, just looking for common threads, little inconsistencies. But what I found was anything but innocent. I uncovered a pattern, a series of questionable land deals, shell corporations, and suspiciously favorable rulings that all seemed to benefit Richard, or people connected to him. It was a spiderweb of corruption, intricate and almost invisible to the casual observer. But I wasn't a casual observer. I was her brother, armed with a broken heart and a burning need for the truth. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. It was about exposing a man who had not only corrupted my sister, but had also corrupted the very system he was sworn to uphold. It took years, thousands of hours of painstaking work, cross-referencing documents, tracking financial transactions, even hiring a few discreet private investigators to corroborate my findings. I used anonymous tips, created fake online personas, and spent countless nights staring at computer screens, the glow illuminating the growing pile of evidence. The more I dug, the uglier it got. It wasn't just land deals. There were allegations of witness tampering, of cases being mysteriously dismissed, of key evidence disappearing. Richard Davies wasn't just a successful judge. He was a criminal in a robe, and my sister, whether she knew it or not, was complicit, or at least willfully blind. The hardest part was knowing that Sarah was part of it, perhaps not actively involved in the corruption, but certainly benefiting from it, her own career flourishing under Richard's shadow. The girl who once dreamt of justice was now tangled in a web of injustice. I tried, once, to reach out to her, to present her with a fraction of what I'd found. I sent her an anonymous package, a burner phone with a few cryptic messages, and a link to a secure server containing some of the more damning documents. I hoped it would be enough, that she would see the light, that she would leave Richard and expose him herself. But the phone was never activated, the link never clicked. She either never received it, or she chose to ignore it. That's when I knew I had to take matters into my own hands, and I had to do it in a way that couldn't be ignored. I couldn't just drop this information with some random journalist. Richard had too much power, too many connections. It would be buried, dismissed, or worse. I would be discredited and silenced. I needed a public, undeniable moment, a bombshell that would detonate in the most secure, most hallowed ground of his professional life, his courtroom. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have let it go? Would you have confronted him privately? Or would you have, like me, waited for the perfect moment to unleash the truth, no matter the cost? The perfect moment finally arrived, delivered to me by a twist of fate that felt almost preordained. A high-profile case involving a major corporation and a small, independent tech startup was set to be heard in Judge Richard Davies's courtroom. It was a case that had captured national attention, a David and Goliath battle for intellectual property. The courtroom would be packed, not just with lawyers and journalists, but with cameras, national news outlets, and an audience hungry for drama. This was it. This was my stage. For weeks, I had been working on a new identity, a completely fabricated persona. I dyed my hair, grew a beard, changed my mannerisms, even altered my voice slightly. I practiced in front of a mirror, transforming myself into Arthur Jenkins, a seemingly innocuous freelance journalist with a passion for tech law. My goal was to get into that courtroom, specifically into the press section, armed with a very carefully constructed piece of evidence that would be impossible to ignore. I had spent months refining a single, damning document. It was a financial ledger, meticulously pieced together from various sources, showing a direct, undeniable transfer of funds from a shell corporation connected to the major corporation in the current trial to a hidden account controlled by Richard Davies. The dates, the amounts, the cryptic notations, it all painted a picture of blatant bribery, not just in this specific case, but in a pattern of rulings benefiting the same powerful entities. This wasn't some convoluted legal argument. It was cold, hard cash, undeniable proof of corruption. The day of the trial arrived, a Tuesday, cold and gray, but inside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. I arrived early, Arthur Jenkins, blending seamlessly into the throng of reporters, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I secured a seat in the third row of the press gallery, directly facing the judge's bench. I watched as the courtroom filled, as the lawyers bustled, as the murmurs of the crowd slowly subsided. And then he entered, Judge Richard Davies. He looked exactly as he did on TV, impeccably dressed, stern, authoritative. He settled into his chair, surveyed the room, and began the proceedings. My sister, Sarah, was there too, not as a lawyer in this case, but as a prominent attorney observing the proceedings, her face a mask of professional interest. She looked radiant, successful, utterly oblivious to the impending earthquake I was about to unleash. The first few hours of the trial dragged by. Lawyers droned, witnesses testified, objections were raised and overruled. My hand, hidden under the table, clutched the single, folded piece of paper that held Richard Davies's entire career, and possibly his freedom, in its balance. I waited for the opportune moment, for a lull in the proceedings, a moment when the cameras would be momentarily fixed on the judge, when everyone's attention would be on him. It came during a brief recess, just before lunch. Judge Davies announced a 15-minute break, and as people began to stir, I knew my window was closing. I stood up, casually, as if stretching. Then, as Judge Davies was about to exit through his private door, I made my move. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I simply, calmly, dropped the folded ledger onto the railing of the judge's bench, directly in his line of sight, as if it had accidentally slipped from my notes. I then made eye contact with him. In that split second, as he glanced down at the paper, then up at me, something flickered in his eyes. A flicker of recognition, a primal, gut-wrenching understanding. He didn't know how I knew, or who I was, not yet. But he knew, with chilling certainty, that the paper in front of him was dangerous. He picked it up, his movements stiff, almost robotic. His eyes scanned the figures, his face slowly draining of all color. The casual murmurs of the courtroom began to fade as people sensed a shift, a sudden tension in the air. He looked up at me again, his gaze locking with mine. And that's when I removed my glasses, ran a hand through my hair, and consciously deepened my voice. "Richard," I said, loud enough for a few people around me to hear, but soft enough to sound like a private address, "it seems you've forgotten some old friends." The judge froze. His eyes, already wide with a dawning horror, now looked like they were staring into an abyss. He stumbled back, bumping into his chair, the ledger still clutched in his hand. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sarah, who had been chatting with a colleague, turned her head, her brow furrowing in confusion. She looked at the judge, then at me, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, she saw it too. Not the Arthur Jenkins facade, but the familiar eyes, the curve of the jaw, the subtle mannerisms that years of disguise couldn't completely erase. Her face went from confusion to utter devastation. "He knows," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible, but the raw terror in it was undeniable. "He knows everything." The gavel slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly on the wooden bench. At that sound, the entire courtroom went silent. Every eye was on Judge Davies, then on me. I didn't need to say another word. The shock on his face, the trembling of his hands, the damning ledger now visible to anyone close enough to see, it was all the evidence the world needed. A bailiff rushed forward, asking if the judge was all right. Richard, however, was lost in his own private hell. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "It's him," he stammered. He's not a journalist. He trailed off, unable to articulate the truth, unable to expose himself. But Sarah, my sister, who had finally connected the dots, stepped forward, her face etched with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. "It's my brother," she said, her voice a raw whisper that carried through the stunned silence. "My brother, Mark." "What have you done, Richard?" The aftermath was a whirlwind. The courtroom erupted. Reporters, sensing a scoop of epic proportions, started shouting questions. Cameras flashed. The bailiffs, initially confused, quickly moved to secure the courtroom, but the dam had broken. The ledger, which had fallen from Richard's hand, was snatched up by a quick, thinking reporter, and within minutes, photos of it were circulating online. The allegations, once whispered in the dark corners of the legal world, were now emblazoned across every news outlet. Richard Davies was immediately placed under investigation, then arrested. The evidence I had gathered, the years of painstaking work, was finally brought to light. It was overwhelming. The shell corporations, the suspicious rulings, the pattern of corruption, it all pointed directly to him. The justice system, once his shield, became his prison. Sarah, my sister, was completely shattered. The initial shock gave way to a profound sadness, then to a simmering anger at Richard for deceiving her, for dragging her into his corrupt world. She cooperated fully with the investigators, providing them with crucial insights into Richard's operations, and ultimately testifying against him. It was a painful process for her, exposing the man she had loved and built a life with, but it was also, I believe, a cleansing one. She began to see the real Richard, the one I had tried to warn her about all those years ago. She lost a lot, her reputation took a hit. Her professional life was scrutinized, and her personal life was laid bare for the world to see. But in losing everything, she began to find herself again. She left the city, moved back to our small town, and started working for a nonprofit organization dedicated to legal aid for the underprivileged. It was a far cry from the high-flying corporate law she once pursued, but she seemed happier, more at peace. We've slowly, carefully, begun to rebuild our relationship. It's not the same as it was, and perhaps it never will be, but there's a new honesty between us, a raw vulnerability that wasn't there before. She understands now why I did what I did, and even though it caused her immense pain, she admits that it needed to be done. Richard Davies was convicted on multiple counts of bribery, corruption, and obstruction of justice. He was stripped of his judgeship and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The legal community was shaken to its core, and for a brief, glorious period, it felt like justice had truly been served. As for me, Arthur Jenkins faded back into obscurity. I went back to my quiet life, no longer driven by a burning need for vengeance, but by a quiet satisfaction that I had, in my own way, righted a terrible wrong. The secret of my identity remained largely unrevealed to the public, a detail that suited me just fine. Sometimes, I still think about that moment in the courtroom, the look on Richard's face, the shattering of his carefully constructed world. It was a moment born of pain, yes, but also of an unyielding belief in truth and justice. And in the end, it brought me back to my sister. So, that's my story. A long, winding road from a forgotten sibling to the person who brought down a corrupt judge. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, and it cost me a lot, but I wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes, the most powerful truths are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to see them. Like this video if you were on my side and believe justice always finds a way. Subscribe for more stories like this, where the unexpected hero emerges from the shadows. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did Richard deserve what he got? Was my method justified? I'm genuinely curious to hear what you think. I'll see you all in the next story.